So I've been doing a little thinking about flooding. And specifically, right now, King County, Washington, the area sort of suburban Seattle, is getting hammered by an atmospheric river type storm event. And it's kind of this is the second that they've gotten hammered with in quick succession, maybe separated by a day, maybe two between major rain events. And completely independently, I recently sort of stuck my nose, or had friends ask me to stick my nose into an issue in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And part of what I might have had to say was about storm runoff. But to the point, one of the things that makes the Pacific Northwest peculiar and the way it is, and specifically, let me back up. If I'm known for anything, it's for my work on debris flows and landslides in the Oregon Coast Range, which you get landsliding there because it's super steep and there's soil on it. And it can get super steep because it never really rains that hard. It rains all the time, but it almost never rains very hard. When it does rain very hard, things fall apart. That's what we're seeing in Washington. We're seeing that it is raining really hard. And it's due to this peculiar, it's a characteristic type of storm, but when it hits a certain area, it hits that area extremely. And you get these, every several years or so, you're going to get some part of the Pacific Northwest coast just get hammered by this just atmospheric river, this river of water that comes in, gets weirdly ramped up over a locally cold air, and just dumps rain like crazy. And these are ridiculously rare events at each site where they happen. Which brings me to another thing, if I was asked on TV or radio or what have you, is this climate change? And I'd be one of those pain in the butt scientists who goes, I don't know if I could really say that this is due to climate change. And here's why. Because if you look at how extreme this pair of storm events is, and you compare it to the assumptions built in to predicting the relative risk of events of a certain magnitude, you run into this issue where they are never going to predict the likelihood of this kind of thing happening accurately. And here's why. Because flood prediction is not based on particular climate patterns and particular meteorology. It's based on statistics of floods. So I've particularly been honed into what's going on in Auburn next to Green River, because that's a case that I know something about. A number of years ago, I was called in to consult relative to a particular levee setback on the Green River in Auburn. And they had sized the levee to accommodate the 500-year flood. And so, all right, let me actually look at the flood statistics. Let me do the flood frequency analysis for the Green River at the Auburn gauge. And it's a weird one because all the extreme events are like piled up at relatively modest flows. Well, why is that? It's because there's a flood control reservoir upstream, and the flood control reservoir rule curve states we're going to do everything we can to keep the discharge at the Auburn gauge at or below 12,000 CFS, cubic feet per second. What's the risk of us failing in that task? And it turned out the 500-year flood that they built the levees for is a case where they don't meet their rule. But they don't miss it by much. They miss it by a few thousand CFS. I think the 500-year flood they came up with was 15,000 CFS. So I'm like, interesting. What's that based on? And it's based on figuring out, looking at historical flow duration or, intensity duration curves for storms in this area, and how high can we take the reservoir, and how much water can the levees accommodate, how much flow can the levees accommodate, and how quickly can we drop that flow back down, how quickly can we get rid of water that's in the reservoir from the storm. And so they're saying, okay, here's our 500-year, which is not, sort of a misnomer. It's the rain event for which the probability of equaling or exceeding it is 0.2% in any given year. Now, what is that? That's the storm that means the probability of the biggest storm that year is that intensity and duration. It doesn't mean there won't be another one almost as big right after it. And in fact, all the statistical analyses have to assume, do assume and kind of have to assume independence, that these storm events are independent and identically distributed. What's that mean to real people in real language? That means that storm has a certain likelihood, a 0.2% say of occurring, but maybe if we looked at it, what's the per day percentage, it'd be some other number, much smaller number, right? And then we wait for that storm to be over. What's the likelihood that, 2 days from now we get a storm at least that big or bigger? And it's going to still be that same likelihood of the first one. Now, what's the problem? An atmospheric river is when this warm tropical moisture-laden air gets stuck in a pattern where it's fire hosing a particular spot on the Pacific Northwest coast. And that means, and there's going to be, there's going to be lulls and more intense bits in that fire hose, right? The person with their thumb on the end of the hose is like, able to squeeze it down for a second and then they let it off and whoosh, right? Not a bad analogy, right? Because that means that, if that weather pattern is stuck there, and I get a big rain event today, the probability of another rain event of similar magnitude and duration is pretty likely. It's not as rare as the statistics assume. That's what I'm getting at, right? Those likelihoods of those subsequent storms coming one a couple of days after the previous, those are not really independent. And the rule curve and so on, the study done by the Corps of Engineers at the flood control reservoir assumes that they are. And if you read the narrative, okay, so there's a couple of aspects of any study, right? There's that final number that they come up with. What's the 500-year flood in this case? And then there's and, but, therefore. there's the narrative around that study. And one of the things they make very clear in that narrative is that they are assuming that another flood doesn't come along, or that the one that of a particular magnitude that they're modeling doesn't come right after one that already saturated their levees, topped up the reservoir. Right, so they can empty their reservoir, but they can only do it so fast. They've got the storm coming. Okay, we know it's coming. Let's get that reservoir stage down so we can accommodate all that water coming in. And then that comes in, and okay, we managed to store that up, and we got our 12,000 CFS target discharge down at Auburn. There's another one coming. We can only get rid of this water so fast until the next one comes. And if that levee breaks in Auburn, if that levee gets overtopped, it's not going to be a true, oh my God, super extraordinary occurrence. It's going to be an occurrence that doesn't match with the assumptions they made in the study. And if you read the study, they said that. They said, this could happen. We're not modeling that. But when the engineers or whoever is consulting the people building the levee down in Auburn, they literally take that one number out of that report. Now, I don't know if they read the whole thing. I don't know if I do know that they didn't pay attention to the fact that the Corps of Engineers study had put error bars around that 500-year flood. No, they had designed that levee to accommodate exactly the number for the 500-year flood that the Corps of Engineers study came up with. No margin for error. No margin for the error that was already reported in the study. And no accounting for the assumptions that are explained in the study, that if you get another huge-ass storm 2 days after the first one, all bets are off. And that's why is this due to climate change? I don't know. It's possible that climate change, and it's even likely that climate change is affecting the frequency of atmospheric river events like this, and maybe also not only the frequency, but the intensity and duration of atmospheric river events like this. But that would never be accommodated in the assumptions going into that flood study, unless they were, right? Unless somebody specifically asked them, hey, the big storms are these atmospheric rivers. Maybe we ought to consider the fact that we might get a storm that effectively lasts for a week or two. And that, when we look back at the record of intensity and duration, we're sort of putting, bounds on this thing, but that whole atmospheric river event included one or, two or more pulses. And our study didn't account for that, and maybe it should have. Let's see just how rare it is to get a series of pulses or some total of intensity and duration over some period of time, like 2 weeks or a month. And that's what the studies generally don't do. And maybe they should, but they generally don't do. And so when the engineers take the results of those studies, they take that one number, they ignore the narrative, and maybe they don't ignore the narrative, maybe they read it, maybe they understand it well. But their standard practice says, no, just take the one number and design for that, because that's what the regulations say you're supposed to design for. Now, you could argue, City of Auburn maybe should have, if they had known, if they'd been sophisticated in their thinking, maybe they should have said, there is the reg that states that you design for the 500-year flood, but, maybe you ought to allow for some error in that. If there's some error bars on that number, maybe accommodate the 95% confidence limits on that number. And maybe even commission a study, since, significant life and property are at stake by this levy. Maybe actually commission another study that has more realistic assumptions, or at least has different assumptions, and see what kind of results you get then. So, if that levy breaks, and I haven't, I'm kind of scared to check and see if it has. It'll be bad. I know that a lot of the town of Auburn is underwater, but I'm not. I don't think it's been the Green River that has been putting Auburn underwater. I think it's a different river. There's lots of big rivers that go through the Puget Sound area. Anyway, that's my perspective as a hydrologist and a geomorphologist. Cheers.